Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're taking on maybe a different kind of mission than usual. We often dive into these complex external things, right? Market data, politics, new research. But the sources we have today, they guide us inward. It's a deep dive into the gentle art of self-trust. We tend to think of trust as something we give out, based on how reliable other people are.
Yeah, and what's really striking about this material is how it reframes that completely. These sources argue that real trust, it's internal, almost like a sacred sense of safety within yourself. It really boils down to how safe you feel just being with yourself. It dictates that inner voice, how you talk to yourself privately, and maybe most critically, how you handle your own emotional world when things outside get, well, shaky. It's like an internal anchor, built on being consistent and reliable with yourself.
Okay, let's try and unpack that from the listener's point of view. I mean, our audience deals with constant information overload, right, from the outside world. So if self-trust is this anchor, where did we lose it? How does the chain break? The research we looked at points to a pretty common path. We stop believing our own choices. We start dismissing feelings as, oh, that's just irrational. And we actively quiet down our intuition, that gut feeling. We end up prioritizing what everyone else thinks over what we kind of know deep down.
That's the core insight, really. This deep dive is about seeing that sometimes that feeling of being overwhelmed or confused, it's not just external noise. It can be an internal symptom of basically outsourcing our judgment. If you're always looking outside for confirmation of something you already sense inside, you're kind of undermining your own ability to know things. So the mission here, based on what we've read, isn't just about collecting more facts. It's about understanding the how. How do you rebuild that internal foundation of knowing you can rely on yourself?
Right. Let's start with the cost then. What happens when we lose it? The sources really hammer home that losing self-trust often stems from self-betrayal. But they make a distinction, don't they, between just messing up and, systematically violating your own needs.
Yeah.
What are the big pressures, external and internal, that push us to compromise ourselves?
Well, if you synthesize the causes, they sort of fall into two main buckets. Externally, you see things like intense burnout, right? Just prolonged stress. And also living in a world that constantly demands proof, hard evidence, quantifiable results for everything. This leads to cognitive fatigue. Your brain just doesn't have the energy to process subtle personal feelings, so you lean on rigid external rules instead. It's easier in the moment. Internally, though, the most damaging thing, it's what the psychological material calls the compromise of core values.
Tell us more about that internal conflict, because the script really highlights this specific painful moment. The moment you realize you chose temporary peace for others over lasting peace for yourself.
Yes. That's the fracture point, exactly. When we consistently choose, say, external harmony, like avoiding a tough conversation, or maybe accommodating someone else's anxiety at our own expense, or just staying quiet when a boundary gets crossed, we're essentially violating our own need for authenticity, our own truth. The sources frame this as cognitive dissonance. You know what you need, but you act against it. The cost isn't always obvious right away, but over time, that dissonance adds up. Your brain logs it like a data point. Okay, I can't actually rely on myself to protect me. And that realization that you've betrayed yourself, that's precisely why you need a deliberate process to rebuild.
That makes a lot of sense. But okay, when we have that realization that, oh no, I've compromised myself, the typical human reaction is often to force it, right?
Yeah.
Grit your teeth, use willpower, push through. But this material suggests the opposite. Rebuilding has to be gentle. How do the sources justify that? It sounds counterintuitive. Doesn't gentle just mean slow? Or maybe doing nothing?
That's a really fair question. The sources draw a line between willpower and sustainability. Willpower, forcing change through shame or internal aggression, that actually spikes cortisol. It creates stress. You might get the task done, sure, but the internal system feels attacked, which just reinforces the idea that changing is painful and maybe not worth it long term. The gentle approach, on the other hand, is about presence, patience. It's about consistently showing up for yourself, even if it's just 10% effort some days. That consistency sends a different message neurologically. I am safe, even when this is hard. It's the steady rhythm of small, truthful acts that rebuilds the foundation, not some big, dramatic push that burns you out again.
Okay, so if we're talking gentle, consistent acts, that must change the way we talk to ourselves internally, too. We get so much advice about loud affirmations, I am powerful, I am fearless, shouting it out. But the sources focus on something different, whispers that feel real. Why is that quieter, reality-based language actually more effective for rebuilding trust?
Well, the issue with those really aggressive affirmations, especially when self-trust is already low, is that they can create an immediate, like, verifiable lie in your subconscious. If you feel terrified, but you're shouting, "I have no fear,"
Hmm.
your brain registers that mismatch, that dissonance again, and it starts to distrust the messenger, which is you. So the material suggests focusing on what the cognitive behavior sections call low-demand statements.
Low demand statements. Okay, give us an example. How does that work in practice?
Right, so instead of demanding this huge instant shift in feeling, you use phrases that acknowledge the current reality but still allow for a little bit of forward movement, like, "I don't need to rush." That directly counters that panicky, anxious impulse. Or, "It's okay to not know." That lowers the shame around uncertainty. And this one's crucial. "Even if I'm scared, I can take one small step."
Hmm.
See? You make the goal tiny and achievable, verifiable. That gives you a small win, a tiny success signal, which helps reduce the immediate threat response in the brain. It shifts you from fight or flight towards, okay, I can manage this. You're building up reliable data points for yourself instead of trying to force this unbelievable hype.
And this is where the material gets really practical almost.
Yeah.
Uncomfortably so. It points out we often expect healing to be glamorous, like a movie montage, a sudden breakthrough. But instead, it involves the very unglamorous act of just sitting in silence when every part of you wants to run, distract, check your phone. Why is facing that urge to escape so fundamental to rebuilding self-trust?
Because distraction is basically the modern way we abandon ourselves. It's self-abandonment in action. When you constantly run from discomfort, that low hum of anxiety, that specific sadness, whatever it is, you're essentially teaching yourself that your own internal emotional world is unsafe, or unreliable, or just too much. The sources connect that urge to run to what some call shatter behavior actions we take to avoid dealing with unmet needs or feelings. So to rebuild trust, you actually have to be present for all of your experience, even the boring anxiety. The mundane stuff, sitting in that silence lets you learn to tell the difference between real danger and just discomfort, which is fundamentally a core skill of emotional maturity.
And being present like that, it leads straight to what might be the toughest part of this whole process, self-forgiveness. Specifically, forgiving yourself for missing red flags, or, as one source vividly put it, the flags you actively painted green. How do the sources suggest we even begin to tackle that kind of deep regret without just spiraling back into shame?
Yeah, that's a heavy one. It requires a real shift in perspective, away from guilt over the outcome, towards compassion for the past version of you. The key insight here is understanding that your past self, the one who ignored the warnings, who painted the flags green, they weren't doing it out of malice or because they were stupid. It was likely driven by a deeply ingrained need, maybe for survival or attachment or just trying to make things feel normal. They didn't have the tools, the perspective, maybe the emotional capacity that you have now. So the sources suggest asking a different question. What core need was I desperately trying to meet back then by accepting less than I deserved?
Yeah.
Forgiving yourself means forgiving the ignorance or the limitations of the past. Realizing your younger self was just doing the absolute best they could with the resources they had available in that difficult moment.
Okay, so that leads us to the next big idea, which really pushes back against a lot of mainstream self-help talk. The sources suggest the way back to yourself isn't about getting stronger or toughening up. It's actually about becoming softer with yourself. Now, that sounds vulnerable, maybe even risky. How do the sources define this softness? Doesn't it just mean being complacent or weak?
That's a really important distinction to draw. In the context of this material, strength is often interpreted as rigidity, right? Hardening yourself to resist pressure. But rigidity, under enough sustained pressure, eventually breaks. Softness, in this sense, is actually about resilience, adaptability, flexibility. It's the ability to feel a painful emotion fully, learn from it, integrate the lesson, and then return to your center without making that failure or pain part of your core identity. This kind of internal softness is what allows you to hear. Well, to hear the version of you that existed before the world made you doubt everything. Before all the noise, the comparison, the exhaustion piled on, that original self isn't actually lost. It's just quiet, waiting for a safe, non-judgmental space to come forward again.
So this softness is really a method, a way to access your authentic internal feedback loop without the usual noise from the inner critic trying to protect you. Okay, let's bring this down to brass tacks then. How do we actually do this? Rebuilding trust using small promises? What's the mechanism behind these seemingly tiny things like drink the water or go for the walk or rest without guilt?
The sources explain this through basically neurobiology. It's about how the brain works. Self-trust fundamentally relies on your brain's ability, specifically the prefrontal cortex, to predict your own actions accurately. When you make huge, ambitious promises, I'll meditate for an hour every day starting tomorrow, and then inevitably break them. You reinforce a pattern of predictive failure. See, I can't rely on myself, but when you make a tiny, almost ridiculously achievable promise like, I will drink 1 glass of water right now, and you do it, you trigger a small, immediate dopamine hit, a little reward signal. That tiny reward loop reinforces the neural pathways linked to reliability, competence, follow through.
Ah, so it's like microdosing reliability training for your brain.
Yeah, exactly. That's a great way to put it. Small wins rebuild that sense of competency, which then builds into self-efficacy. That's the psychological term for actually believing you can succeed at things. And something like rest without guilt, that's a direct challenge to the whole burnout culture, isn't it? It's a promise to honor a basic physical need. It validates that your well-being matters more than just relentless productivity. These small acts are practical, tangible steps in gently, slowly rewriting that internal dialogue we talked about.
Let's focus on that dialogue rewrite for a second. We know shaming doesn't work long term. So say I mess up. My immediate internal reaction is probably critical, harsh. How do I gently but effectively interrupt that and rewrite it in the moment without just pretending it didn't happen?
The core technique suggested across the research is basically replacing judgment with curiosity. It's a simple shift, but powerful. So when you make a mistake, instead of the usual, ugh, you idiot, you always do this, you try to catch it and intentionally shift to something like, okay, that was difficult. What was going on for me just then? What triggered that decision? Or what information did I maybe lack in that moment? It shifts the focus away from like character assassination and towards situational analysis, which allows for learning, not just more internal damage. The fundamental principle here is absolutely critical. You cannot shame yourself into lasting healing. It just doesn't work. Transformation really requires self-love, and that includes gently acknowledging when you fall short. Love, or maybe compassion, is the engine that actually allows our internal systems to repair and grow.
And the result of all this transformation, it sounds like genuine internal freedom. When you finally reach that base level of trusting your own emotions, your choices, your sense of timing, life starts to feel safe again. Not because the world suddenly becomes predictable, because, let's face it, won't, that's an illusion, but because you become your own reliable anchor. You know you can handle what comes. Hashtag tag outro.
Yeah. When you synthesize this whole deep dive, the main takeaway really is that self-growth. It isn't some frantic race towards perfection, some idealized version of you. It's much more of a quiet, deliberate return. A return to feeling safe within yourself. It's about allowing yourself to be unsure sometimes or slow or even a bit messy, while still consistently taking the time to learn from it all and honor your own authentic rhythm.
And I think what that ultimately reveals is the core requirement for real peace. You don't actually need to become extraordinary or perfect or incredibly productive to be worthy of peace, according to these findings. You just need to become fundamentally honest with yourself. And to remember that, you were always enough long before the world started trying to convince you otherwise.
Which leaves us with a final thought for you to maybe sit with as you continue your own journey. Healing is really about finding your way back home, to yourself, one gentle truth at a time. And part of that involves intentionally honoring those parts of you that just kept showing up, kept going, even when you felt completely lost, unsure of where home even was anymore.
Yeah.
That quiet, persistent capacity to just keep showing up for your own life, even in small ways. That is the tangible proof of your inherent worthiness. It's already there.